So I know in previous videos people have talked about, or previous videos have mentioned the K2 and the possibility of being sent to Ukraine at any point in the near future. People have kind of shot down, saying, "Yeah, South Korea wouldn't do that." There's a lot going on as far as like the Polish deal in terms of their production of the K2PL and kind of tech transfer and tech share, I guess. But I think there is a case to make for the Ukrainian Black Panther. And I know that, yes, this, like, at the time it was initially produced, like, the most expensive tank at the time. But with economies of scale, Polish production, that'll probably bring it down to a more reasonable price, especially if we see other countries adopt it. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But why talk about this? And why have a new background? Let me know if this looks stupid, if this is corny. But I thought I'd change it up a little bit and look like I'm talking about military stuff instead of giving a lecture on synergy. Anyway, so this is kind of a continued conversation from what tanks should be sent to Ukraine. And more so kind of a vision of what tanks would Ukraine use as a formal single possibly piece of equipment for most of its tank forces. With Polish production eventually coming online over the next several years, that is something that will enter the conversation more likely than not. And the K2's capabilities being one of the most modern tank systems around that may beat out some of the more notable names out there depending on what you're looking at. So what am I actually going to talk about today? So we're going to take a look at the T-64, T-72, T-80, and T-84 series of tanks. We're going to take a look at the geography of Ukraine. We're going to take a look at the K2 specs and features, the industrial side of it, politics and logistics, my personal thoughts, my thanks, and upcoming videos. This will probably be a little bit shorter than some of my other videos. So the T-64 series used the D-81T or the 2A46 125mm smoothbore gun. It had composite armor with explosive reactive armor. If you've seen the memes about what the Challenger 2s are going to look like in Ukraine or the Leopards that are just covered with ERA bricks, that's what that is. A road speed of 37 miles an hour. Anywhere from 310 to 430 miles in terms of its operational range. It has day and night sights for all three of its crew members, the commander, the driver, and the gunner, but no thermal optics on the base version. Some other versions may have that, so kind of keep that in mind, but generally most of your T-64 variants aren't going to have thermal sights for your gunner or your commander. Then you get up to the T-72 series, which is one of the more prominent series we're seeing in Ukraine, both on the Ukrainian and Russian side. Using the 2A46M or the 2A46M5 125mm smoothbore gun, kind of just an upgraded variant of what we saw in the T-64. Composite armor with ERA, a road speed of 47 miles an hour, a range of anywhere from 290 to 430 miles operational range, and once again, the base version only has day-night sights for all three of its crew members, no thermal sights. Different variants may have thermal sights, but base version and most of your general versions that haven't gone through more recent modernization packages aren't probably going to have thermal sights. Some of the older upgrades may have like first-gen thermal sights, but they're probably not going to be holding up super well now. Then you have the T-80 series. So if we look, the Ukrainian inventory is going to be largely made up or pre-war and what they had before donations and stuff. With captures, what they already had, T-64, T-72, with a lot of variation. Like, there have been a lot of different modernization packages from Russia, from Ukraine, and from the different countries that have donated them, like Poland, and I think the Czech Republic and Slovenia. So, keep that in mind. I think the Slovenians, it's the M55, so it's different. But regardless, it doesn't matter. They are all varying degrees of this, but generally speaking, your armor with a varying degree of the ERA bricks and the gun are going to be the same. Your operational range, your speed, and your sights will differ. Then you have the T-80, which is one of the newer ones. This from a base production from the Soviet era, the newest generation tank designed before the fall of the Soviet Union. So you have the 2A4, the 2A 4.62 125mm smoothbore gun, composite armor with ERA, once again, a road speed of 50 miles an hour, so it can go a little bit faster. Operational range, not quite as far, though. And this is the first iteration of thermal sights we'll see. Once again, several different variants of the T-80 out there, and the Ukrainians kind of have their own spin on the T-80. But this is the first time you're starting to see like first-gen optics, thermal optics for at least the Commander. Some variations may have gunner optics as well, or gunner thermal optics as well. And then you get the T-84M. This was the indigenously produced tank of the Ukrainians based off of the T-84, thus the T-80, thus the T-84, using the KBA-3 125mm smoothbore cannon, composite armor with ERA as well. And as you see, this is starting to get more of a westernized style look. 43 miles an hour top road speed, so not as fast as the baseline T-80. 310-mile operational range. Stay pretty much the same with your optics. Your Commander has a thermal, your gunner and driver have day and night, and has the water fording capability of up to 5 meters, which is more than pretty much any other modern tank the West uses. This was something that they had developed and were producing in kind of low rate numbers for themselves, and I believe they were doing some upgrade packages or just repairs to Pakistani ones as well. We'll take a look at that in a different video. But this is kind of the most modern tank that the Ukrainians were fielding before the invasion. Now that they've kind of captured some T-90s, it's a little different. But generally speaking, this was kind of the pinnacle of the time. So territorially, geographically speaking, this is kind of in a smaller degree what I was talking about in my IFV for Ukraine video, right? Elevation and waterways are pretty important, but it's also important to recognize that a lot of central, eastern, and southern Ukraine are all in pretty major river basins, so the ground holds a lot of moisture, turns into mud very quickly, especially during the rainy season, the Rapudista. I hope I said that right, or else I'm going to look like an idiot. I look like an idiot a lot, but that's fine. It doesn't matter. Most of the Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts are pretty flat. You have about a 200-meter variation in terms of overall height, but it's not mountainous, right? It's not sharp peaks. It's generally kind of low-rolling hills, if anything. If you saw the IFV video, you'll have a reference in terms of kind of where those are, but you start to get more mountainous peaks up kind of north of Mariupol and into the Donetsk and Luhansk areas. So you have some terrain in which normal tanks are going to have some slight difficulty. Now, it's not to say that any of the tanks that exist out there would have problems with this type of terrain, but it is something to consider that this terrain is more difficult for armor to operate in. As far as waterways go, well, this is a river basin. There's only a handful of tributaries in these areas. You will see more networking down there in Donetsk and Luhansk, but once again, in Zaporizhia and in Kherson, not a lot going on there. There is like 2 major tributaries, or I guess rivers coming out of the Sea of Azov, I suppose. So not massive, but it is something that those can hinder mobile operations, especially if bridges in the area have either blown or cannot handle the weight of your tank. Something to think about. But does it match with that of South Korea? No. South Korea is significantly more mountainous. Now, of course, you do see a lot of that green area around the coastlines. That is relatively similar to the geography of Ukraine, but most of central and eastern South Korea is significantly more mountainous and closer to that of Norway, which we previously looked at, than it is to Ukraine. Now, there are in terms of waterways, more concentrated than that of Ukraine, but Ukraine is a significantly bigger country. That being said, waterways are something the South Koreans do think about in terms of how it hinders their performance of their larger mechanized or armored movements, their maneuvers, as you will. And that is shown in the K2. Now, not as much as the T-84M, but generally speaking, so far in the war, we have not seen a ton. Of course, I don't know that it's something that people particularly want to stop and take videos of, but we haven't seen a lot of tanks or armored vehicles fording waterways, so it may not be as big of a deal, but having that capability with a country that is pretty dense in terms of its waterways is pretty important. So what about the K2? So the Black Panther uses the CN-08 125mm 55 caliber smoothbore gun, has an autoloader that is fed from 16-round clips with 40 rounds stored, an effective firing range of 3,000 to 8,000 meters. Now, one of the things we'll take a look at in a minute, a lot of people have talked about depleted uranium rounds. And while that is something that is a whole nother conversation, the K2 brings another type of round in that is possibly, in theory, maybe more destructive without having the same kind of environmental problem. But a lot of people, someone pointed this out in my Norway's tank trials video. So someone in the comments had said that a lot of the stuff internally on the K2 was German machinery. The gun was based off a Rheinmetall gun. But the newer batches, so like the first batch possibly, a lot of that was in there. But this gun is fully developed indigenously in South Korea. It's not a licensed production of a German gun. The engine, if I'm correct, is also South Korean at this point. I think the drivetrain or the transmission might still be German, but they're getting to the point where it's all pretty much internal. And then, of course, the K2PL, the Polish version, will have different internal machinery as well, but generally speaking, it's kind of that. It has composite armor with ERA, and someone did mention, I think in my tank video, or maybe it was my Norway trial video, to talk about the armor, talk about the armor thicknesses more. And I did think about it. I took it into consideration, and I generally thought if I can't really talk about the different types of composite, just because, like, even the Chobham armor from, like, the Challenger and its kind of equivalent on the Abrams, that information's not public. Like, we don't know actually what these composite materials are made out of. And while we get general thickness ranges, it doesn't, like, most tank rounds are going to penetrate at some point on the tank, and ATGMs are probably going to have success kind of wherever they're at if you don't have an APS system. Now, the K2 being so new, it has some kind of APS system, active protection system, a hard kill system. We don't know what it is, and we don't know if the K2PL is going to have a different one, from my understanding. So I know there are people out there that probably want me to talk about armor thicknesses, but I'm sorry. You can look it up if you want. I don't know how well I think those numbers are really going to make a difference, since most munitions and ATGMs can penetrate from a good variety of angles on most of these modern tanks. And your well thickness isn't necessarily something to forget about. The efficiency of your APS, your hard kill systems, is, I think, going to be more of a big deal as a comparison to armor thicknesses. So, thank you for bringing that up, whoever it was, but yeah, I'm just that's why I left it blank, because I wanted to put this little caveat in. Then you have a tank crew size of 3, which is something the Ukrainians are used to already. You have a commander, a driver, and a gunner. There's no loader because it uses the autoloader. So, that round we were talking about, the K-STAM, or KSTAM, the Korean Smart Top Attack Munition, basically fires it, from my understanding, very big arc, pops a parachute, finds what it is, a secondary charge ignites top down, very much like a javelin in terms of concepts. That is something that gets around a lot of the armor thickness, because you're not, like, you can put, as most people have termed it, a cope cage on top of your turret, but you're not, like, going to put the same degree of armor on top of your turret that you have on most of the rest of the tank. So that is something that may make a much bigger difference, and with the way that Russian tanks are designed, if that gets into that carousel of munition and sets it off, that tank is not coming back. That is not something you're repairing the damage on. That tank is fully out of commission. You also have the capability of firing ATGMs out the barrel. That's a pretty regular modern thing. Most tanks can do that. You do have thermal sights for your commander and gunner, and one of the more advanced digital battlefield management systems. Now, once again, we have very little detail on that, but from what we've been told, that is kind of the case. This is something that has gone up against the digital battlefield management system of the Leopard and at least been comparable, at the very least, if not equivalent or better. Now, we don't have any official reports or confirmations yet, but from what people have said in the comments, now, take that with a grain of salt. The rumors they have heard in Norway and Sweden, sorry, once again, sorry Sweden, sorry Swedish people, the K2 outperformed the Leopard. Now, once again, no details. When a report comes out, I'll go through it and talk about it, because I want to know how that broke down, and if that's more of a difference in machines or just Norway's really unique terrain. But regardless, the K2 to even be considered against the Leopard is a big deal. Norway was already rocking Leopards. They could have just very easily, like the Czech Republic, said, hey, we're going to go with the A7. But no, they were like, hey, we'll entertain the K2, and well, we'll see how that goes. But from what people have said, from rumors they have heard in their local communities, that is what is there. So when we see a full report, I'll talk about it more, but it's at the very least to be considered in the same trials, a pretty big sign. So, as we've looked at previously in the Ukrainian tank video, all of the tanks, not the K2, but we did look at the K2, obviously. So 55 tons, 54 long tons, 61 short tons. It's about 10 tons lighter than most of your Leopards. So it is significantly lighter. That's a pretty big deal. A road speed of about 43 miles an hour, operational range of 280 miles, water fording capability with no preparation, 1.2 meters, with 30 minutes of preparation, 4.1 meters, and operational range, once again, of 280 miles. You think I would pay a little bit more attention when I do these, but I do the initial thing and serve that as my outline, or when I go into record videos, but I also go through and make changes for several weeks. So sometimes I put something in there and I'm like, oh, I forgot to put that in there, and I put it in here. So my bad, guys. And then you have the semi-active hydropneumatic suspension system. This is probably one of the single most important things for this tank, next to the K-Stam and its general lightweight. It has 4 different modes that it can operate in, and this is something I believe we've seen with some wheeled vehicles. I don't think the AMX-10RC has this capability. We've seen it on some similar wheeled vehicles like that. So it sits, which it lowers itself towards the ground so it can maintain higher speeds on roadways. It lowers its center of gravity, so it's not as big of a flip risk. It can stand, so it can raise itself up on its suspension for better maneuverability in more difficult terrain, particularly pointed to mud, I believe. Now, of course, mud is mud. It will get anything stuck, so it might handle mud better, but yeah, it's still going to have the possibility of getting stuck, especially in areas like Ukraine. But it'll probably handle it better than something like a Leopard would, especially being lighter weight and having the suspension system. It can kneel, so it can effectively push its forward axis down, push the back up, so it can kind of creep over a hill, fire without exposing too much of the tank. And as you can see, it doesn't have a tall profile already, so that makes that a little bit easier. And then you have the lean capability, so you can lift one side up while depressing the other, and vice versa. From what has been said by the South Koreans, it's supposedly easier to maintain. I don't know if that's true. We don't see a lot of tanks with it, so I don't know if it's actually easier to maintain or if it's just easier for the South Koreans to maintain because it's something that they're using on their MBT. But generally speaking, we'll probably know more when the Poles start using theirs. But this is some visualization. So as you see up top there, that's the kneeling. That's pushing that butt up quite high and pushing the forward portion down so you can creep over a hill, fire without exposing almost any of the tank. There on the left is just actually it traversing. When I was looking at that photo, I was like, oh yeah, this is 100% it doing the lean thing, but I don't actually. It could be. It's hard to say. It could just be uneven terrain. But there on the right, you do get to see the kneel. The right side there is depressed. The left side is raised up. So if you're going over more difficult terrain, this is something like South Korea's mountainous terrain that comes in handy very, very regularly. Industrial concerns. So you, of course, have the... I'm really sorry to anyone from Ukraine or that is familiar with the name of this because I'm about to butcher it. I am very, very sorry. The Malyshev factory. Fingers crossed that was close. So that has been producing tanks and still has been repairing tanks since the start of the war. It's also located in the Kharkiv Oblast, so this wasn't like on the other side of the country. This was prime targeting for the Russians, and they did strike it a couple of times, but it has been working, from my understanding, pretty much throughout the war. Pre-war, it was doing all of like the T-84M and like newer variations of that, I suppose. I'm not sure if they changed the designation, but this was also where like Pakistan's tanks were getting, we export partners, repaired or upgraded. This is also just like a heavy industry factory, so I think it also does like it did tractors and things like that. Then you also have, so you have that pre-established capability, that one main factory there. Alongside that, you also will have the Ukrainian recovery efforts. So think of this as like a miniaturized Marshall Plan for Ukraine, right? This is something that you have the Antonov serial production plant on the other side of the country, or kind of, I guess, more to the center of the country, but you know what I mean. That's something that is still actively, from my understanding, working. I do believe it has been hit a couple of times, but I don't think it's been destroyed. It's just capabilities aren't 100 right now. Canada and Turkey have both talked about joint projects in terms of building new factories and capabilities in Ukraine. So they're already kind of getting a start there. Turkey, it's more the Bayraktar factory than anything else. But Canada has got a couple of different, I think, munitions factories in the works, with Ukraine mostly coming like through Canadian capital. And then you have, of course, like I said, export partners, largely being Pakistan. But the Ukrainians were servicing tanks. They were designing, producing tanks, maintaining tanks, going through foreign tanks and either upgrading them or bringing them back to a certain degree of standards. But this is something that, you know, it's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, what is the latest battle situation, very reasonably so, because, you know, we're witnessing history unfold here. This is the first major European war in most of our lifetimes. This is a big deal. But there's a lot of forethought that needs to go into what it looks like after, right? And I know that's hard to do because it's like, well, what if things change and everything? But, you know, it's something that, even with the Marshall Plan being this big thing, it did take a while to rebuild Europe effectively. This is something that, by comparison, a fairly small portion of the country has been occupied. It's still a lot, obviously. I don't mean to diminish the suffering that is happening. But if you're looking just geographically, land available to build new factories, build new industries, build new power plants, build new anything, right? In Ukraine, there's a lot of land that's not gone used, right? There's still a largely agricultural-based economy, one of their main exports being agricultural foodstuffs. So it's not like the number one, it's not their only export, obviously, but it's one of their big ones. So looking into what kind of investment goes in after the fact is pretty important. And if South Korea is really pushing the K2 and it works out really well for Poland, it's something I wouldn't be all that surprised to see some kind of agreement, right? Now, it's not to say it will, and, tech transfer is a big deal, and, Ukraine borders Poland, so maybe there's some overlap there. But much like Poland, Ukraine has heavy industry, right? Now, of course, it's not been as westernized as Poland's, but, you have to think a lot of investment was also happening at the fall of the Soviet Union, the years after that. Now, it's not to say it, happened quickly, and there's still a lot of economies that struggled and still do struggle with that transition to being a Soviet state to being a more westernized capitalist economy. But it is something that the conversations and the thoughts should be happening. Whether it's Canada actually taking those steps and saying, hey, we're doing this, or just, going through things like the EU and talking about Ukrainian recovery efforts. These things are important, and with existing industries, both in production as well as energy and agricultural production, very important. So there's a lot there. I'll talk about it probably more at a later time, probably the end of the year. I'll probably talk about more of like the Ukrainian economic recovery efforts, but I wanted to bring it up here. So what about the politics and logistics of it all? Well, generally speaking, political relations are a thing that Ukraine's kind of, it's been, of course, Zelensky going around and trying to petition different countries to say, hey, we need the help and things. South Korea, since it's not geographically close, is not the top of that list. But it is something that we should keep in mind. South Korea has been very open-minded in terms of trying to export into Europe and break into the Leopard's territory effectively. So with the Polish production of K2s, whether or not tech transfer and production happens in Ukraine is hard to say. But if Poland does carry through with their whole intent to build 1,000 of these bad boys, the price is not going to stay the same. The economy of scale is going to come into effect at some point. So it'll probably push these down to a much more reasonable cost. And if you're able to produce them indigenously, that also helps pretty significantly in terms of cost, in terms of like it doubles back in terms of investment into your local economies and things, and tax revenues. But whether or not, Ukraine gets the same deal is hard to say. I think we'll probably, once we get kind of towards the closing stages of the war and see how territorial reclaim, how much territory Ukraine's able to reclaim, whether it is the pre-invasion territories, whether it's including the Donbass and whether it includes Crimea, is going to really impact the calculus of what South Korea decides to do, of course, if they go forward with this route. But even still, I think I wouldn't be uber surprised to see the Poles probably look at some kind of export deal for K2s with the Ukrainians. Whether or not that's the case, it's hard to say. If Ukraine gets a fair few tanks donated or lend-leased or whatever through the war, kind of like the Challengers, maybe then, they're going to use what they have and wait a while for any kind of new tank procurement. But if it is something that coincides with growing your industrial base, that makes more sense. But I wouldn't be super shocked if, like, post-war, after several years, once the economy's kind of getting its footing back, that we maybe see some kind of discussion like that. I do think Norway's tank trials, when we get definitive results, are going to make a huge difference here. Not necessarily in terms of like the South Koreans sending K2s or the Poles sending K2s, but I think it could change the calculus for Romania and the Czech Republic. It could change the calculus for Ukraine. If this is something that, if we're looking at, once again, it depends on the results as well. If Norway decides to go with a K2, but largely because it handles their terrain better, the Leopard's still not out of the, running for any of these countries by any means, because most of mainland Europe is not nearly as mountainous or frigid and Arctic as Norway is. But if they're going to go say, hey, the suspension system is really knocking it out of the park, and some of these other internal systems are really going nuts, and that's why we chose it over the Leopard, that's a big deal. And that would change the calculus for a lot of people. Outside of the tank trials, though, regardless, I think conversation's still going to happen anyway of Hyundai Rotem looking to be like, hey, listen, we're trying to expand, and the Poles are making the K2. How do you feel about making just a regular K2 or maybe like a K2U in Ukraine? And try to focus the Poles as far as their entryway into Europe, and look at Ukraine as their entryway into the Balkans and maybe even the kind of Black Sea region, right? Because you do have the Turks who are also using some tech transfer of the K2 to do their own Atlan tanks, or Atla tank. So it is possible they kind of do that, and with them being so close, if they're fairly similar in terms of composition, they could kind of, trade parts as they needed. But I do think that we'll probably see questions of investment in some of these areas, because, Ukraine has been in I wouldn't say economically speaking, Ukraine was one of the countries that were very hard hit by the fall of the Soviet Union and really never fully recovered, right? This is something that with a lot of investment could change. Now, not to say it will, right? Because prolonged investment is something that's different than kind of initial recovery. But expanding into a country that has the capability to defend itself very adequately and has had major success against a larger power is going to be pretty prime ground for a lot of defense industry people. So, some special thanks. This was a quick video, I know, just like the other tank videos, but generally kind of my quick point there. The K2 with Polish production is going to be pretty rockin' tank, and if it does come out over the Leopard 2A7, it's probably going to, do the rounds in Europe pretty well. Anyway, Tank Encyclopedia for graphics, of course, the profile of the tanks, they're great for that, but they have a ton of really good information out there in terms of development and combat history if a tank has had combat. Wikis, either Wikipedia or the military wiki. You're going to probably find deeper information on the Tank Encyclopedia most of the time, but for just general base statistics, most wikis are okay. So once you start digging into places, that it gets problematic. Oryx, as far as visually confirmed losses, and I just realized I don't know that I talked about that in this video. Oryx is just a good source that are probably going to be in most of my videos. Battle Order Perun, the Chieftain, the Tank Museum, some people I didn't list here that aren't necessarily particularly as tied to the K2. Maximus, Task and Order, Any Marchi History, Red Effect, all great channels. Go check them all out. If you've stuck with me for 30 minutes, you're going to like at least one of these channels, so go check them out. And then militarytoday.com also is a great resource as far as like kind of your more regular news. And then what am I looking at in the near future? So my first forays into geopolitics, just purely focused on geopolitics, I suppose. With the upcoming Chinese crisis and the Russian Federation's fall from grace, I know those are going to be somewhat mildly controversial, probably not as much in the West, but that's going to upset some people, and I do apologize in advance, but it is something that both of those countries have a lot going on just even outside of the war, and there's a lot to look at, so I want to talk about them. And, of course, I'm not just going to rag on either country. There are systematic problems in both that we need to look at. Or that I want to look at, rather, I guess is a way to say it. Eventually, I'll get around to making the case against the F-16 for Ukraine. Once again, don't think it's a bad plane, just maybe not right for Ukraine in the middle of a war. And then Ukraine's forgotten tank with the T-84M Oplat. Anyway, I know I probably missed some stuff for you K2 experts out there. Pop some information in the comments down below that I skated over or didn't miss or got wrong. If you have any questions as well, I'll do my best to answer them or at least point you in a direction of a person who can. And I will see you next time. Thanks for staying tuned.